So here we are. So let me introduce first the program and myself. My name is Biljana Tanurovska-Hulavkovski, one of the people from Lokomotiva. And I would like to wish you a good evening in frame of our program, Contemporary Cultural and Cultural Policies, Other Spaces. This is the program of Lokomotiva in Kinokultura, which is a project space for contemporary performing arts and culture. And due to COVID-19 now is therefore, we transferred our programs for the last 4 months online as a statement or also as a claim for a new public space, if that can be so. Since the one that we were developing, as I said, Kinokultura and sharing its copy for the last 3-4 years, it's closed. So we still don't have these protocols for organizing programs in public space. Thus, this is our new temporary, let's say, arena or public space in which we can act. So shortly, in this program, Contemporary Cultural and Cultural Policies, Other Spaces, we developed 2 programs. One is Archive of Reflections, and the second one is this series of lectures and discussions. So we have the honor to start with Katja Praznik, a colleague and a friend, who will be more thoroughly introduced by my colleague, Violeta Kachakova. So just quickly, lecture by Katja Praznik will be followed by lecture of Eleonora Montagnier, held on 2nd of July at 8 p.m. also, and by Alvis Favotto on 6th of July at 8 p.m. So we programmed this series of lectures and discussions related to the topics which we are busy at the moment to research and develop, topics such as position of the artists and cultural workers in the labor market, relations between artists, managers and the public, as well as mutual influences with the social authorities, environment in which we operate. So the lectures are related in order. They have some order from our point of view, and will bring forward ethical dilemmas and thoughts related, as I said, with the labor of arts, with social justice, responsibility toward the relations between us and the field, but also society in general, as well as environment, nature, etc. So just to say thank you for the program. It's possible to be online to Ministry of Culture of Republic of North Macedonia, the city of Skopje. And also this program is part of Other Spaces, which is a program by ACT. This is Art, Climate and Transition, a project that we just started, European project, co-funded by the Creative Europe program of the European Union. And for the realization of the program, I would like colleagues, Violeta Kachakova, who and for realization of this online session to Nena Tonkins. So I'm ending here. Thank you, Katja, for coming. And I would like to introduce Violeta Kachakova, who will continue with the session.
Thank you, Biljana, for this lovely introduction. Thank you all. Good evening from my side. So today we have Katja Praznik, and she will have a lecture on the subject Invisible Labor of Art, a contribution toward a labor equity in the arts. And after the lecture, everybody that follow can give their questions in the comments on the Facebook stream. So we will transfer to Katja and she can answer. Shortly, I will introduce Katja. She is currently assistant professor in the arts management program at the State University of New York at Buffalo. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Ljubljana. She is really much involved in the research which is focused on labor issues in the arts during the demise of the welfare state regime. So besides having lots of lectures, essays, text dealing with this subject, she also has 2 books written. The first one, which is published in 2016 in Slovenian language, is called The Paradox of Unpaid Artistic Labor, Autonomy of Art, the Avant-Garde, and cultural policy in transition to post-socialism. And the next one, which will be published very soon for the University of Toronto Press, it's named Artwork, Invisible Labor and the Legacy of Yugoslav Socialism. Before moving to United States, Katja was a very active member of or cultural worker in the independent cultural scene in Slovenia, in Ljubljana. She was working as a freelancer in Slovenian independent art scene, mostly related her work to the field of contemporary performing arts and contemporary dance. Besides being a dramaturg to very important names of the contemporary dance, she was also involved in dance theory and research, and she was editor-in-chief of Maska, performing art journal, since 2007, from 2007 till 2009. Also, she was a very active member of Društvo Asociacija, which was very much engaged in the struggle of improvement of the working conditions of art workers in Slovenia. So we personally and professionally know Katja since that time, since the time of Maska and since the time of Asociacija, where a kind of some regional movement or initiative started to develop around the initiative of Culture, the regional network for culture, the national network for culture in Croatia, that kind of tried to organize or initiate some kind of regional collaboration dealing on the regional level. And when I'm saying region, I mean the ex-Yugoslavia, for really advocating for the position and the condition of work, but also working rights of the independent cultural actors. And after that, very recently, 2012, Cooperativa was formed as a regional platform in which Lokomotiva was one of the co-founding organizations from the ex-Yugoslavia region. So since then, we have 10 years behind us, and I'm really happy that after these 10 years, even not collaborating directly, we were really engaged in following Katja's work, and I'm really happy that we have her now in the program of Lokomotiva to give her reflection, research, ideas, and some clues about how to reposition maybe, or how to treat the to make the invisible visible artwork in the nowadays of contemporary neoliberal societies. So Katja, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this really generous introduction. I am really delighted, and I would really like to thank you both, Biljana and Violeta, and the team behind the other members of Lokomotiva. I'm very honored and humbled to be invited, and I'm really happy to talk about these topics because you know, let me just start by saying that, right, as you could hear, I have been involved in issues of unpaid labor from a very practical point of view while I was still in Slovenia, but then once I moved to the US and started to work in academia, I'm now really engaged with training my students who study arts management that labor issues, working conditions are important, not just for artists, but everyone that works in the arts. So what I'm going to talk about today, it's actually part of this larger book project that Violeta mentioned. So this book called Artwork, Invisible Labor and the Legacy of Yugoslav Socialism. So this book is actually using Yugoslavia let's say, as a stepping stone or a case study to reveal what I now call the paradox of art. So I shifted a little bit from the paradox of unpaid labor to the paradox of art. And this means that I'm trying to deal with the persistent mystification of art as labor, and what are some of the dangerous consequences of this mystification. So when in the book I use Yugoslavia to show that this mystification of artistic labor is a deeper problem. So it's a more insidious, deeper problem that crosses political and social systems and shows itself in both capitalism and socialism. So as a process through which artistic labor is used for the production and alienation of inequality. So the book actually links socialist political economy and the study of art to animate a critique of the relationship of art and labor. And so what I'm arguing is that issues of unpaid labor, of invisible labor, are the effects of deceptive and misleading representations of artists' labor in Western philosophic and aesthetic traditions. And I point out and present the difference of the Yugoslav model, but I also show the historical trajectory of how changes happen to art and artistic labor and how neoliberal tendencies prevailed after the 1980s. Even in a socialist country, and how they, after the breakup of Yugoslavia, the violent breakup of Yugoslavia, how they contribute to unsustainable working conditions for artists. So the book shows how precarious working conditions for artists get normalized and why the idea of art as an act of creation, fueling the contemporary neoliberal discourses and policies, is actually detrimental for artists and creative workers. So what I'm going to try to do today is I have three things on my agenda. So I would first like to talk a little bit about what I mean by the paradox of unpaid labor or the paradox of art. Then I'm going to introduce briefly this analogy that I developed between artistic labor and domestic labor to discuss how we can demystify this artistic labor and its understanding that it's not understood as labor. Then I will try to briefly talk about one example from the 70s, socialist Yugoslavia, about an artist. His name is Goran Đorđević, and he presents one of the really one of the best articulations of this mystification of artistic labor and how can we critique it. And then in the end, I want to conclude with a more contemporary examples of collectives and people also beyond the beyond the post-socialist context that are dealing with these issues, because these are global issues, right? I wanted to actually say, like, right, so what is this paradox of art, right? And in a nutshell, I would say that the paradox of art is a denial of labor or work that is involved in the art. And it actually results in some kind of exaltation of artists and a very rampant economic exploitation of their labor, right? The unpayment or erratic payment or poor payment or even no payment, right? And I wanted to illustrate this paradox with a very recent anecdote that happened to me last year. Actually, it didn't happen to me, I was just the witness. I was invited by a Slovenian artist, photographer, to participate in his project. He was dealing with some kind of also discussing this problem of different symbols and why we believe in them and what are the consequences of us believing in these symbols. And of course, I said, like, okay, I'm going to take you as a symbol of what do we believe in when we talk about the art and the artist and so on. And I said, like, well, I want to know what are your labor conditions for this project. And of course, we discussed how is he remunerated, and he told me that he is going to be paid for the project about 300 euros. He was working for a local public institution in Ljubljana. And when we were talking, he has been already working on this project for about 6 months. And so then I also had the occasion to interview the director of the gallery where the exhibition took place. And I said, okay, so what is the budget of the exhibition? And the budget of the exhibition was 30,000 euros. So there was a huge discrepancy, right? The artist gets paid 300 euros for his work. The budget is 30,000 euros. What was great was that the budget covered the material costs, which is rarely the case when one does a photographic exhibition, but nevertheless, right? And so, of course, in my text, I have addressed this issue, right? This discrepancy of why do we have such an enormous budget and why is the fee so low? And then everyone, I mean, especially, of course, the director got offended and went to console the artist, and she told him, like, you're not doing it for the money. right? And this is a very, I would say, a very common way of how people try to console the poorly paid artists, right? This is, you're not doing it for the money, right? We're doing it for something else. So, what is interesting is that there have been other sociologists who have talked about unpaid artistic labor, and they have labeled it as sacrificial labor. So Andrew Ross, he's a sociologist working in the US. He said that artistic labor could be understood as sacrificial labor, because on the account of the enjoyment of this labor, artists are willing to give a discount, right? We are not paid, or artists are not paid as much because they're enjoying their labor, right? But the problem is that, of course, everyone, including the artists, need to survive, right? We all need to pay our bills and so on and so on. So the question then is, who can afford sacrificial labor? And so, so let me kind of summarize, right? So the paradox of unpaid artistic labor is this really contradiction between a lofty status of the artist and the rampant economic exploitation. And the central kind of like the gist of the problem is that artistic labor is not understood as labor, right? It is understood as creation, as a desire for self-expression, for expressing creativity, and so on and so on. And even in the general, right, in the cultural perceptions of artistic labor, this is very often the case. And that's why artistic labor today serves as a right, artists are model workers. This is like artistic labor is the blueprint for contemporary neoliberal work ethics, right? Which is, if I summarize it in a little slogan, is like, do what you love what you do, right? And then you are not concerned with the payment, right? So we have this contradiction between an elevated status or respect for artistic labor, but on the other hand, very poorly remunerated labor, poor working conditions, lacking social security, and so on and so on. And so many people say that, right, that the largest subsidy to the arts actually doesn't come from the governments, from all the donors, but in fact comes from the unpaid labor of the artists. And so the question remains, why is this labor glorified on one hand and devalued economically on the other? So my argument is that this Potemkin village, in a way, has to do with the fact that art is not considered labor, right? That art is, like I said, being understood as creation, passion, love, self-expression, so on and so on. And of course, there has been a history to these kind of representations of artistic labor, and especially they're connected and linked to the 18th century romantic philosophers such as Kant, Schiller, and so on, who have devised of artistic labor as something which goes beyond the pecuniary or economic concerns. And so it is there that this demystification of artistic labor kind of developed, and it divorced these productive activities such as artistic labor from other forms of labor, right? But like I said, unless we are independently wealthy, we all need to work to survive, right? And work is, of course, not just an economic practice, but it is related to status and so on and so on. But most people in capitalist societies need to work for wages or have to be supported by somebody who does, right, in order to survive. And so paid work is in fact a structural condition that defines our lives. Of course, there's a discrepancy between how much we earn in particular types of jobs, but we all need to do them in order to pay the bills, unless we are independently wealthy or we have property and we can bank on the rent that we can make from that property. So the problem, of course, today is that the neoliberal logic is trying to convince us also that work is not necessarily something that we do in order to make a living, but that work is something through which we, which we express our personality. So we have an emphasis on this divorce from why do we do work and what are the consequences, right? And so these neoliberal ideas about do what you love what you do, right? And don't worry about the payment because it will eventually come, are really problematic, and they dissolve this notion of labor, right? But labor belonging to the realm of psychology and not to the realm of commodity production serves as a justification for this poorly paid labor, right? And artistic labor falls squarely into this mentality, right? We are doing it for everything else but money, right? And even like, I have this really interesting and funny quote from a text from Belgian philosopher Dieter Lesage, who wrote this really great text, A Portrait of the Artist as a Worker, which was actually published one time long ago in journal Masca. And he says, you are an artist, and that means you don't do it for the money. That is what some people think. It is a great excuse not to pay you, right? So, okay, so now we, so this is the paradox, right? This is what we are dealing with. But the question then becomes, right, why? So, you know, oftentimes I would talk to people and they would be like, well, you know, I'm not trying to denigrate artistic labor in any way. I appreciate it myself, and I think it is very important, but I'm trying to point to the fact that if we are elevating this work and we are essentializing it to a creativity, self-expression, and so on, that we then make this work invisible, right? And in this is where I would like to broaden this comparison between domestic and artistic labor, right? So in the sense that artistic labor remains to be understood as non-work, as an expression of creative personality, it parallels the understanding of domestic labor as the natural attribute of a female subject, right? And so housework is a woman's calling. For instance, there has been really important critique of housework done by feminist Marxists, and one of them that maybe you are familiar with, Silvia Federici, wrote this really great text, Wages Against Housework, where she makes precisely this argument, right? That because domestic labor is transformed into natural attribute of female physique and personality, it is become invisible, right? It is not work that we do for the money, and that's why women also can fight against their exploitation. And so what this text and what Marxist feminists did was that they pointed out that there is this mechanism of essentialization and naturalization, which is problematic in the wage-conditioned economy, right? And so if something is done out of love and not out of money, there's a question of who can afford doing that, and if you can't, why are you not then paid fairly? So when particular skills, such as artistic labor, being understood as an self-expression, the need for self-expression or creative expression and so on, are constructed as non-work, this leads to economic exploitation, a poor or non-existent payment, and so on and so on. So that's why I'm arguing that we should strategically, politically understand artistic labor as work, because this provides tools for demystification of artistic labor, for demystification of some type of exceptionality, and then offers a strategic point in the struggle for equity in the context of institutionalized art, right? Which is what I mean is all the classical, traditional Western understanding of art and art institutions within a lot of people operate, right? So what is important, right, is then not necessarily, like I said, I'm not trying to denigrate this labor, but I'm trying to say that if we are using a legitimizing discourse of exceptionality, creativity, self-expression, and we are essentializing this work, we have a problem, right? Because then the payment gets contingent on the success and merit and so on and so on. Social security becomes problematic and so on and so on. So the issues just compile, right? And so what is of course interesting when we come to this comparison between domestic and artistic labor, right? There's a lot of distinctions, but maybe I can go into those later in the discussion because we have limited amount of time. But what I'm trying to say is that this is like an important theoretical insight that feminists have made, that I think is useful for us when we try to defend why artistic labor has to be paid, why it has to be protected in terms of social security, health insurance, and so on and so on. So, but the problem, of course, is that in the context of art, right, while feminists were criticizing these essentializing ideas, in the arts, there is a persistent trait that this labor still is talked about as autonomous, as creative, as right, that this is a form of decommodified labor that we do in order to politically protest capitalism and so on and so on. But the problem that I want to point is that, again, we come back to the exploitation, to the economic exploitation. And that's why I think that many times art theorists, art critics perpetuate these same problematic ideals of idealizing artistic labor and divorcing autonomy from economic concerns. And this, I think, is a huge, huge problem. So now I want to come to Goran Đorđević, right? So like I said, in Yugoslavia, Goran Đorđević was one of really fascinating artists who has worked with a group of conceptual artists in the end of 60s. He was originally working in Belgrade, but as you know, socialist Yugoslavia, in terms of conceptual art and all the neo-avant-garde art, was very connected. And so he criticized artistic labor, and he said that the notion of creation and creativity is in fact a theological notion, right? That when you create, right, you are like God. You create something out of nothing, right? And that's problem number one. And then he criticized that human creativity is an illusion, right? And that art is actually a form of religious practice when we treat artists as these creators. And for instance, the way he tried to point that issue out was that he, at one point when there was a triennial organized in Belgrade, they invited him and he asked them, right, what is the budget for the exhibition? What are the financial resources? And, you know, how is the budget being distributed? And he never got an answer. Of course, he didn't get an answer because they didn't want to discuss the budget, right? Because probably the artists were also not paid. And so, and what he concluded is that while the entire system of art depends on artistic labor and the figure of an artist, artists are nevertheless not the subject and primary agents of this system, but he said that artists are a pseudo-subject. Right? So they are a quasi pseudo subject and they're just the instrument in the artwork. So I'm going to read a quote because I think it's very telling from his text where this becomes very clear. So he says, since the art system practically disposes with the entirety of material resources allocated by the society for the artistic activities, the artist is forced to accept the relations and rules of behavior prescribed by this system. This doesn't concern only the division of material resources through which various and numerous directors, curators of museums and galleries, members of diverse committees, councils and boards, critics, professors, secretaries, etc. provide for their existence thanks to the existence of something called artwork, but also to practically exclusive right of decision about the division of the rest of the material resources dedicated to the organization of artistic activities, right? So what he's saying is that the institution of art has an enormous social power, and the artist in this system is its weakest link, right? Because it's practically dependent on the art systems, on the systems of which confirm that they're excellent, good, great, and so on and so on. Also the division of resources is not in the hands of the artists, right? But everyone else. And so art and artworks have value due to this collective enterprise of and discursive practices, criticism, and so on and so on. But artistic value is tied to the object or to the event or to the output, right? Because it's not just the object, it can also be an event. And not to the artistic labor. So this is where this invisibility comes in, right? The production of aesthetic value is also hierarchical and predicated on the invisibility of this artist's work, which is understood as non-work, as an act of creation. So, and because these artists are these geniuses which create this kind of work, they don't have to be paid, right? And so, the other thing that is important here, right? If I come back and link this story of Goran Đorđević and his critique of artists as a pseudo subject to the feminist intervention, right, in the invisibility of labor, is that, for instance, in her text Wages Against Housework, Silvia Federici points out that demand for a wage is not a demand for a lump of money, but needs to be seen as a political perspective that allows demystifying and subverting existing social relations in order to reimagine them, right? And so vital for such a subversive move was precisely to divorce housework from its understanding as a natural inclination of female subjectivity. And the power of this move, I argue, is that in the context of art is embodied precisely in Đorđević's declaration of artists as a pseudo subject, right? So remember the anecdote I gave you at the beginning of this photographer, right? He was paid 300 euros. The budget was 30,000 euros. He did, I mean, this is, right? Everyone else's work was paid, including mine, I wrote the text. I got paid more than the artist for writing my text, which is absurd, right? And this is the inequality, this is the hierarchical organization, and why it is a problem when we say that artists are doing this kind of work for all other reasons than but money, right? So let me kind of summarize, right? So both this contemporary anecdote that I gave you from last year and these artists in the 70s in socialist Yugoslavia point to the fact that the issue of unpaid artistic labor are the effects of this deceptive, misleading representation of artist labor in the Western philosophic and aesthetic traditions. So artists and scholars contend that the artist has become a model worker in the new service economy, right? And so on. And of course, artistic labor, which has originally historically been perceived as or conceived as something which has nothing to do with the money, has been abused also by neoliberal transformation and by neoliberal promotion of very particular type of work ethics, where creativity becomes this petri dish, right? Be creative. There's a great book by the name escapes me right now, a British scholar, Angela McRobbie, Be Creative. Like, she has a whole book in how this idea of creativity is embedded in many, many policies, and we all are familiar with them because that is also how, right, our work is often being defended, or that's how we maybe occasionally get paid or get some kind of social security and so on and so on. So I think that there is a problem here, right? And that is, again, I want to stress that I'm not saying that what artists are doing is not important. Quite the opposite. I think it is very important, but I think that the reinforcement of artists' exceptionality, rather than an emphasis of the fact that they do actually do work and they need workers' rights, engenders this concealment, right, which makes artistic labor increasingly invisible and increasingly not understood as a form of labor. And I think that that is a huge political problem on our hands, right? And there are, of course, again, many, many differences, especially I would say that if I'm speaking now to the people who live in post-socialist context, right, there is a difference if you are working on an independent scene, if you are working in an NGO, or if you're working in a public institutions. There are many contradictions with this understanding of artistic labor, because people who work in public institutions very often do have those protections and do get paid for their labor, while people working in the independent NGO scene don't, right? Or it's way, so there's another paradox that we can tackle and discuss later on. So the problem then, of course, is, if I kind of try to come to a conclusion, right, that this dissolution of labor identity of artists is pitches creativity versus subsistence, right? If you want to be creative, you can have the social security, the payment is going to be contingent, right? And that's why neoliberal logic has taken the artist as the model, right? Because that they need to do it. They have, you know, there's a passion, there's all that, right? And artists have been always understood as these self-relying, self-sufficient subjects, right? And this is perfect for neoliberalism. The more we rely on ourselves, the better for a capital accumulation, which is gonna bypass all the workers who are doing the hard work. So, and I think that the other problem is that, of course, neoliberal policies have also resulted in disenfranchisement of social security and labor rights, right? So, and internally, the transformation, right, of labor is vested in this instrumentalization of autonomy, of artistic labor, of creativity, of importance of self-expression, right? But the issue is not why have artists become the model workers, but rather why does creativity have to be divorced from payment, right? Social security, labor rights, that's the question, right? Is if we have the autonomy, why do we have to have the autonomy without the economic rights? These two things have to be tied together. And so essentializing artistic labor to interpersonal traits rather than understanding it as work, then also, again, contributes to this dissolution of the idea of labor. Quickly, just to conclude, I want to give you, I would say, a very hopeful example that in fact paradoxically comes from the United States, where workers' rights have always been a huge problem and have been detrimented even before anywhere else. They have been poorly respected, as opposed to, let's say, right, socialist context where the workers' rights were always highlighted and they were always respected to a certain extent. So WAGE is a collective of artists that are based in New York. WAGE is W-A-G-E with dots. You can check them on the webpage. They have a webpage and so on. So what they have created is they call it wage certification. And wage certification is a program that recognizes non-for-profit organizations that fulfill or exceed the group standards for fair compensation for people who work in these arts institutions. And so what they have done is very interesting, is that they have made a scale of organizations and their annual budgets, right? So a small little NGO is not going to be able to pay the same fee as a huge, let's say, MoMA museum or some huge public museum. And so they have made different tiers of how these should be paid according to the annual budget. And this is, I think, an elegant solution, right? Because for some small NGOs, this can be really symbolic, right? And a lot of people have said like, well, but these fees are symbolic. But if there is a commitment and a recognition that this labor has to be paid, I think this is the step in the right direction. So, and so I think that this form of organizing is really something that that can be used, because it has been promoted and talked about in different contexts in Europe and in US. And I think that it involves, it's like a twofold strategy, right? There is a demand for artist fees, and it asserts the economic and artistic value of the labor, but it also rejects this notion of artistic labor's exceptionality, right? So one of the main coordinators of WAGE, Lise Soskolne, she declared in one of her really interesting texts called On Merit, she said, an artist's fee is not a reward, right? Payment for artistic work derives from the fact that it is subcontracted labor. Therefore, for artists' fee is the closest thing that one can get to a wage, right? So when artists create and when their, let's say, artwork or events are being produced in different kinds of organizations, this is in fact subcontracted labor. So we shouldn't mix these two things, right? And so even if we consider art practice to be personal, intellectual, or autonomous activity, the status of what we produce changes if it becomes part of a commodity exchange with a cultural institution, right? And even if these institutions are not for profit, if they are not making profit, they do pay everyone else. So they should also pay fairly everyone else that participates in creating such events. So demanding wages for artistic labor, like wages for housework, I would argue is a productive political strategy, particularly in society that is both fundamentally defined by wage and subject to neoliberal rationality, because it allows art workers to establish political alliances by rejecting the ideology of exceptionality and actually create solidarity. So I'm gonna end here. I hope I was not too long, but this is my 10 cents on the topic.
Thank you, Katja. It was very inspiring. I was like researching before and reading some of your text, and I hope we will have some questions from the people that are following live. But before that, I will start with some of my questions. And then I would like to maybe draw some kind of parallel. You did it by yourselves, but I would like put it the other way around, which was this art paradox and pseudo subject, which was your example that you have described about this Slovenian artist, but also it was the same situation happening with Goran Đorđević. And this happened for the Triennale in Belgrade, and it was in the 70s. And this is happening now, and it's in 2020. And we have totally different political, economical systems, even though, as you said, that from the beginning of 80s in Yugoslavia, we have this very visible shift of how kind of this capitalism starting to be accepted as not ideology, but as a practice, naming as a social state, but the practice and policies, especially imposed in work of art, started slowly to go to this entrepreneurial logic. So my question is, because now we have, even then and now, what is relevant is this commodification of art or objectification of art, no matter if this is event or art object as an artwork. And we have two levels. One level is this socio-political or economical system in the neoliberal capitalism, and another level working within the system is the institution of art, which I think that they're connected, I mean, in between, because the institution of art works within the system around as kind of supra level. So my question is, because we have now how many years, 50 years of applying this kind of logic, even though discussed, advocated for making this paradox of exceptional artwork to be put in the economy aspect, not only the object, but also the process of creation of the object, and still we don't have many positive kind of turn of the situation besides some kind of examples of initiatives. Do you think that this is possible to be changed in the system of neoliberal economy as such as we are living, that started to be developed from the 80s? Or we need to have a totally another type of political and economical organization of the society in order to become aware of the need of equality of the work of everybody, including artists, so they can their work to become visible and waged?
I mean, this is a great question, right? It's the question. So the way I would say is that, yes, on one hand, these systems that are currently operating are really oppressive. I think they atomize the people, they create a lot of conflicts on smaller levels, right? In terms of how we can fight for better payment. And of course, I'm an optimist. So I think that the things can be changed, and that I agree with you profoundly that the issue of art, or the Western idea of art, right, which is a very historical idea of art, which is connected to all these Western types of institutions such as museums, galleries, theaters, operas, orchestras, and so on and so on, right, that this institution of art is profoundly linked with the rise of capitalist mode of production and the way things are done and the commodification, right? But and that, of course, the larger and the main goal is to change that to change this mode of production, right? But how do we do that? There's, it's a question. So I think that when we then focus on the context of art, it is really important to really start thinking about right, different forms of labor, and that that while our labor is being commodified, right, that we do need to acknowledge that when we come to the arts. And I don't think that this takes away from an artist's autonomy, but it is quite the opposite, because if somebody gets paid, then it also means that they can, right, that they are not dependent, because very often the argument is, well, but if you get paid, that's suspicious, you lose your autonomy, you're in the service of this and that, and people can manipulate you, right? I don't think so. I think if somebody gets paid, if somebody has social security, health insurance, that gives them, in fact, way more autonomy in the capitalist system, right? And I get it that this can be understood as a reformist strategy, but I think that since we have to deal with this burden, historical burden of how artistic labor is perceived as something that is like not work, or we do it for fun, or we do it for even more noble reasons, that there is really an important way of acknowledging that this is work that has to be paid for. So I would say that, yes, absolutely, we need to change the system. We need to think about what underlying values, what is our economy for, who does it benefit, and so on. Absolutely. But I also think that the fact that this is such a astounding project that has been going on for I mean, decades, centuries, and so on, that we do need to also understand that there are steps that we can take on a daily basis in terms of shifting the discourse, changing the policies, changing the way we advocate for why art is important. For instance, I even suggested one time when I was presenting this work of mine, I said, like, if you start arguing that everybody needs to be paid in the arts, that's how you increase the budget for the art, because everyone has to be paid all of a sudden, right? Not because art is so important, no, because people who work in the arts working and need to be paid. So that's where the increase in the budget can come from. But I mean, again, so I think that there's many ways of how we can approach this. But like I said, yes, I agree with you that the problem is, of course, capitalism, the logic of capitalist accumulation that commodifies everything that we do these days. But that we should not lose hope and say, like, okay, we'll wait for the change. We can't wait for the change. We are the change. We need to do the change. So we need to start somewhere.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And then this is something that it goes to me to think about the self-responsibility of artists. And then to this parallel that you draw between the feminist critique with the invisible or unpaid art in the domestic or reproductive work with the artistic work. And I found your in a few years ago in interview with Jasna Žmak when you were also lecturing in Croatia. And then I really like the term that you used, the labor of love, which you can imply it in both cases. So as you mentioned that which is totally different in feminist critique, they are like women are fighting against this unpaid labor. The art critique sometimes is still glorifying this importance of work of art or artist as a creator and idealizing artistic labor and divorcing for economic value, as you said. Yeah. So my question is, like from my experience, that the work that we started like since very actively since 2015 with Biljana and our colleague Ivana Vasova, really working on advocating the working rights of cultural workers working in the independent cultural scene here in Macedonia. What we notice is that many of the artists or cultural workers are not aware that are being workers and still living in this romanticism or ideology of doing something great and special and then don't want to be compared with the, let's say, in quote, ordinary workers. And this is like things that I don't know how to emancipate artists to really claim for their economic value in order to have bigger mass of activists that can claim their rights and change the condition on micro level in every local or national economies.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree with you that, every time I present this critique, and especially because I also critique a lot the autonomy of art, you know, people get very offended, they get very defensive, and because, but I always have to emphasize, the point of my critique is not to diminish the importance of art, but quite the contrary. I just want to ask, why do we need to divorce these two things? Why, why do you have to claim that your work is exceptional and reject the payment if you live in capitalist society? It's just, and the other thing that I've noticed in the art circles, right, is that that these idealized notions of autonomy, creativity, self-expression, right? These are, I think, very, very important political ideas, but they are not practical in terms of everyday life of artists, right? And I think that one question that I think is important is that many times these proclamations are being uttered by the people of a certain class, right? And I think that that is something that I have noticed, especially since I've moved to US, right? Because I think that in Yugoslavia, there was this, the workers' rights were somehow idealized, right? They were not treated as something that is negative, right? I think it was, there was a sort of pride about the fact that people had these rights and people were fighting for them. At the same time, of course, as the conflicts within the socialist context happened, right, there was a question about, like, how do I distinguish myself from a ordinary worker, right? And I think that this is precisely what I said at the beginning when I started my talk, is that the idea of art and creativity as something that is elevated and different, that is not understood as labor, is extremely problematic, because it creates hierarchies in types of work, which I think are very problematic, right? Especially when we then live in capitalist society, where the fact that we work is, in fact, for many of us, how we earn our living, how I pay my bills, how you pay your bills, how most of us pay our bills, is that we work and we get paid for what we do. And so I think that that's one thing, right? And then the other thing is also that it's really important to question these perceptions of creativity and autonomy, precisely because I think that degradation of work definitely happens within capitalism, but within the arts, it's paradoxical, because this degradation happens on the account of elevating and proclaiming and essentializing a type of work. And that, I think, is contradictory, and it's just something that I think we need to discuss. I think that's a work of, you know, critical reading and critical meetings, and that and explaining the distinction between the fact that it is politically strategic to define yourself as work in if you operate in capitalist economy, right? That this is a strategic, like Federici said, this is a political perspective, right? It's a political perspective to figure out why is your work invisible and exploited and unpaid. And I think that that's an important conversation that we need to have. And I have noticed myself that within artistic circles, people were like, oh no, we don't want to be workers, we don't want to be workers. I'm like, what's wrong with that? What is wrong with you being a worker and being able to get certain kind of entitlements that other workers have? So yeah, I think that this is just something that we need to keep putting on the agenda. It's, you know, because I think that cultural perceptions are really something that are very strong, like you pointed, right? Georgievich has the same issue. We have the same issue. I mean, like, this is an ongoing issue. And so that's why I think it is important that within the context of art, we start having these conversations and what we use as legitimizing, right? And how do we not forget about the class perspective in the arts, right? Because I think that that is what ostensibly happens, is when you have these notions of autonomy and of creativity, you depoliticize artistic labor, right? As if working conditions in the arts are not important, or they have to be discussed separately. No, these two things go together. They cannot be separated, right? But I think that the depoliticizing effect is that you then eliminate class differences, within the context of art, and also the different economic hierarchies that are at play here, right? Like I said, 300 for the artist and 30,000 is the budget, and it's just not possible.
Yeah, and this even becomes, as you said, the paradox on many different levels, because as we are coming from these post-socialist countries from the Eastern Europe, so it's this can be implied mostly on the artists and cultural workers working in the non-institutional sector. If we are saying that the welfare state in Yugoslavia and post-Yugoslavia started demising in the 80s till now, starting with the same type of law, which was in the same year in Slovenia in 1982, and in Macedonia, which was the law for freelance artists, where now the freelance artists are the ones that are being responsible from themselves, and they are obliged to take care of their social benefits related to their wages, with the wages and the social benefits. And these kind of different models are introduced, where you can give some benefits in social security on different type of calls regulated through the Ministry of Culture, or in Yugoslavia through some kind of republic commissions, when these benefits can be paid only to a certain number of independent artists, but the others are left alone. Even though you mentioned we have this self-employed or sole proprietor, as we say here, or I would like to say a person company, which is totally like
idiotic, yeah.
Then you have people employed in the NGOs or engaged in the NGOs, which are also self-employed in the different model. And so we have this demise of welfare state goes to neoliberal logic, but still in certain amount stays as a welfare state for the public institutions. And this is even more visible now with the COVID situation, 19, in a way that now the welfare state or the social state is protecting the public institutions and the people working in the public institution with regular wages and social and any type of related security, which I think it should be like that, and it should continue to be like that, even though the institution have many different other problems in the context of cultural policies. But on the other hand, the independent or non-institutional sector is totally devastated, and there are some kind of measures which are very limited in the support, which are not enough to really maintain some basic survival of certain type of cultural workers. So we have this really kind of antagonism in a way of what social state means today and for which category of workers or artist workers. So I suppose it's more or less the same in Slovenia now.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, like I wouldn't even talk about the welfare state anymore, because this is the neoliberal state we are dealing with, right? The way everything is legitimized, even in the terms of cultural policy, is really based on this merit. Like this has come out very much, right? If the committee recognizes the merit and all this stuff, you need to produce, you need to get awards, you need to, I mean, like you name it, right? And then you, because you are good, you compete with all other colleagues in order to get your social security subsidized. As opposed to everyone else who doesn't even have this status. So in Slovenia, there's a problem that you have these self-employed people with status and without, right? Then you have the employed people in the public sector. And so the people with the status can get the subsidy of social security and healthcare. Some people just don't. They get some tax incentives and they pay, they can get some tax deduction, but I mean, it's peanuts. And so that's the problem, right? That you have in different categories of these workers, but for both, for self-employed with the possibility, it's a competition with other colleagues to get that possibility. And with the others that are just self-employed, maybe occasionally some other ministry would have some kind of subsidy, but other than that, they just depend on themselves, right? And like you say, the COVID crisis really exposed the whole neoliberal devastation of the idea of work and the idea of social security in a broader sense, right? Of welfare security for the people, right? What are we doing? Like, how are we protecting? Who is protecting these rights? And so I think that that these things are becoming global precisely because the welfare state mechanisms have been detrimented and they have been preserved for a very, very tiny group of public employees. And also these public employees are now, right, their rights have been also chipped away slowly, right? So they can join that boat very soon, right? It's very easy for them to get fired and so on. So I think it's a common struggle. But again, when we come to the arts, it is the perception and the problem of merit, right? I also see that there are some questions here.
Yeah, there are some questions. So it's good. I will read it now. How we, in this context, XU, which is also defined by wage and it's subject to a neoliberal rationality, can reject the accepted and promoted institutional and political ideology that artist's work is exceptional or is a work of love or a hobby, especially in the independent art scene. What should be the strategy that will enable us to communicate the understanding that our labor should be paid, that we are working and our work is not a hobby as understood by the administration and political elite especially?
Yeah. Well, I think, that we have a couple of tools in the bag, right? On one hand, a lot of research about artists and creative workers in general has affirmed that these are highly educated people. So you get the education, right? You are educated. And so, right, that there's again this idea that this is not a hobby. You can get an education and you can get different kinds of acclaim. So I think that in that sense, this is beyond the discussion. If each state and every country has as many art schools, this is professional work, is number one, right? And then there has to be a distinction between survival and reward, right? Because of course, even when you work in school, nobody questions, is teaching your hobby? No, it's not your hobby, no? It is not, but then, if there still can be room for rewarding excellence if somebody is stuck on that. But I think that we need to fight for the fact that artistic labor is a type of professional labor that's like any other kind of labor.
Yeah. The next one is Bill Roseberry, sacrificial labor and outdated romantic philosophy as the present common perception of culture in general.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, sacrificial labor, so I'm not quite sure if I understand the question, but I think that, yes, that the romantic perception is that, right, Kant said that something along the lines that when we do artistic labor, that this is something that is beyond the financial concerns, right? That there is this idea of disinterested enjoyment of aesthetic pleasure and so on, right? Both in creating and that's from the creator point of view and also from the point of view of the audience, right? As if the money, the financial concerns evacuate. And I think that these are really heavily ingrained cultural perceptions, like this question says, right? And they also affect culture, right? And that these are the stereotypes that we need to untangle, deconstruct, criticize, and keep what is good from them, but make sure that we bring in the economic aspect, the other side, right? The dark side of the unpaid labor, or, like So yeah, I agree that that these traditions and these historical conceptions are really a heavy burden.
Yes, so you mentioned this wage initiative, if I can say it like that, which is practically totally based on kind of culture of solidarity or kind of general agreement where everybody can contribute depending on their overall budget or annual turnover to pay the creative process of certain number of artists. What do you think, what kind of other political strategies or self-organization or struggles can be done against the unpaid cultural and artistic labor?
Yeah, what is interesting about wage is that this is right, that this is a grassroots coming from the art workers themselves, right? They did research, they figured out how poorly they're paid, and then they came up with this proposal, right? But because cultural policy or this idea of like state regulation of anything, and God forbids culture, is an anathema in US as opposed to Europe, where we are very used that the state would regulate certain things, right? So that's why they created this certificate, and they do have a whole thing developed of how they certify you, you really need to commit, they check it and so on and so on. But it is voluntary, right? An institution has to say, okay, we want to get the certificate because we want to commit to this. You can't make them do that. But, right, this is where I think that it's interesting to study the history of socialist Yugoslavia. Because as I have discovered in my research of all the archives and history, 2 years after the conclusion of World War II, I'm sorry, in 1946, Yugoslavia passed a regulation of minimum fees for everyone, for all the artists, for every work. So, you know, there are ways we could, of course, the request. I mean, there have been many proposals, right? You could request that the ministry demands, but the question is that we need to really be careful about the systems that regulate our work, right? So I think that this has to be a collective, common undertaking. On one hand, you have professional associations which should develop, like, you know, at least some sort of payment strategies. Then we should advocate that the ministry imposes this from anyone that receives public money. And just in general, I think that this idea of solidarity, of common struggle, of really building these alliances, right? Because I also think, for me, what was so paradoxical about that anecdote that I had, right, with this photographer last year with 300 versus 30,000, is I'm like, if you are the director of an art institution, it is in your interest to pay wealthy artists. How can you not support that? Right? So I think that there's another level of advocacy that we need to talk to people who sit in these institutions, who have the power, because very often they would say, well, but we can't do much. It is not true. Right? We have different positions of power in the system, and we need to acknowledge them. And a director of a museum does have some power. It is not, they are not, or he or she or them, they are not powerless. So they have some power. You have the power within the NGO. I mean, there's many ways of how we can tackle this, right? Even like with this overproduction. For instance, what is interesting now with COVID is that everything was canceled, right? And I mean, there are many, many ways I think that we can approach really in very concrete steps in terms of how you can navigate these issues, right? But it is really, I think, a question of, you know, getting some kind of common ground, and then also really paying attention to on what level should the regulation happen, right? Because the other thing is that in that sense, right, a lot of artists are precarious. And they are precarious in a similar way as journalists are. They are precarious in a similar way as many, many other types of precarious, unprotected, as housewife labor, right? Which is this exploited, unprotected labor. So we need to, there are broad alliances that could be made, right? But of course, again, within the field of culture, then certain representations will have to fall. Certain ideas will have to be examined, deconstructed, criticized in order to understand why could you have an alliance with a group of independent journalists which are facing very similar issues. So I think there's many ways to really go about it, right? And that wages way is one way, and that, you know, I mean, this is one that I got very fascinated from, because it was one of the first initiatives where I saw that somebody is not afraid of calling artistic labor actual labor and demanding pay, and not seeing something negative in that statement. And I think that that for me is great. Now, where we can take this, we have to talk about, right? I mean, it's like it's a suggestion, but I think it's a really important one.
Yes, I totally agree. So I will pose my last questions, and it's a personal one to you. So to make a parallel between this Eastern Europe and Western societies, so how do you see your position as a cultural worker in the context of invisible work of art as being part of Slovenian independent scene, and now as being part of the academia in the United States, the country with, let's say, the most developed neoliberal system?
Well, you know, I think that it's again, right, you have to recognize the context in which you are. I think that on one hand, for me, the invisible labor and unpaid labor was something that was affecting me when I was a cultural worker in Slovenia, right? So it was personal, but it was political, and it was structural, and it was a problem. And so since I moved to US, I think, and especially because I teach in an arts management program, I really take it as my role to inform the students about the ideas of what is art, how it is historical, how are these cultural perceptions perceived, and what is their role, right? So I think that at this point where I am a protected polar bear in the public system of US or New York State, is that it is my role to, you know, to be able to transfer this critique to the people that are gonna go in the field, to people who are gonna work in the arts, and that can, you know, and you know, to use my ability to write and to talk and to discuss, to really bring these issues into focus. So with the students, as with other people who are working, right, in the arts. I think that that's kind of like, you know, it shifted a little bit, because I'm not so concerned. I'm more concerned with the educational aspect, which I think is really interesting. Because when you get younger people to study arts management and arts and culture, they are full of these really idealistic notions of art. And while I want to preserve them, and I commend them, and I think it's important that they do this work, I really want to also emphasize that they are really extremely aware of the conditions in which they're going to work, right? Because in US it is very hard, like you said. I mean, most arts organizations are non-for-profit, some are for-profit, right? And they are also struggling on many different levels, right? And there's a lot of hierarchies. For instance, there was a really interesting initiative by people who work in museums. They have established a whole chart where they have listed how much they're paid. So it was gender difference, it was all, you know, like racial differences, the different positions in different museums paid crazily differently. So, right, but people have started to talk about that. For instance, another interesting move in US that has happened in the last couple of months and maybe a year is that people started to get unionized. People started to get unionized because they said, like, okay, all these fancy arts institutions are constantly doing the lip service to different kinds of social ideals, right? But at the same time, all this social idealism is carried on, the brunt is taken by unpaid or poorly paid, unprotected workers. So how do we, right, put your money where your mouth is, what they would say here in US. So I think that there has been an increasing awareness precisely because the class distinctions, the economic discrepancies have become so prevalent, right? And so, yeah, that's, I don't know if I answered your question. Like,
yeah, you answered my question, and I mean, thank you for doing this great work. from before, continually dealing with this important subject, but also, as you mentioned at the end, like trying to spread the virus among your students and really to become aware, because the new generation are the one that will continue the advocacy and the change of system within arts, but also in general within the overall socio-political sphere. So I was really pleased, and I can say this in the name of the Lokomotiva, that you were our guest lecturer today, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be part of the program Contemporary Culture and Cultural Policies.
I'm happy anytime. I love to talk about this. I think it's really important, and I think that you guys are doing really important work. I know that like you have a lot of energy and persistence, and I think that it is really important that you are doing this work, and I'm always happy to talk and support these efforts in any way I can. So it has been really my pleasure to have this conversation and to be able to talk and spread some of the, I don't know if I want to call it virus, but a different kind of thinking.
Thank you, Katja, once more.